With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halverson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, we hear from a hog farmer who tells California voters not to give up hope about their Prop 12 votes. We'll have more on that, but we start today with an important discussion on H5N1, first called the bird flu, or highly pathogenic avian influenza. Our first guest today is Dr. Russo of RSM Consulting, who is an expert in animal disease. To start off with, thank you for taking some time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You were just on a webinar talking about H5N1. We keep getting new letters and numbers and things added, but let's start off with talking about the high path avian influenza. And it has been such a big topic this year with the way that it's spreading, especially into dairy herds. Tell me a little bit about what are the latest findings, and what do we need to know right now?
So right now, we've essentially seen this virus jump into a new mammalian host species, which is cattle. That started in Texas, and we've seen different states become sort of new hotspots for the virus. So it started in Texas, moved into Michigan, we saw it in Idaho, and in those dairy pockets, you see large numbers of dairy farms that become affected with the virus. So currently today, the hotspot is in California. So California has, I believe, listed 41 dairies that are now positive for that virus. And given the fact that California is the largest dairy producing state, I think that we'll see considerable additional cases that will be added to this particular outbreak. So that's where we sit in California. But ultimately, the goal is to try to get in front of the virus with folks that are epidemiologists. And so those individuals are like detectives for essentially determining how viruses spread in populations. And so the goal is to get some epidemiologists, boots on the ground, to those dairies really early on in the disease course in order to better define how the virus is moving between operations and within operations, because even though this outbreak's been going on since the beginning of this year, we still don't have that very basic information yet.
And so do we have epidemiologists that are now working boots on the ground in this area? Have they been able to get started at these dairies?
So there is one particular epidemiologist, Dr. Jason Lombard, and he is a professor at Colorado State University, but he was with the USDA for several years. So he has been working in conjunction with the USDA. I think they provided him with some funding in order to run some of these investigations. So he ran some in Michigan. He was invited in and got some really great information that he shared this week on some of the California dairy calls. And I believe he is looking for operations in California that will allow him in order to run some of these investigations that are so crucial to defining this disease.
What would you tell our listeners out there who have dairies and are concerned about this and are maybe thinking about should they have this person come out to their ranch?
Absolutely. I would say this virus, the data we've seen so far indicates that the cows are infected long before they show clinical signs. And so by the time you're seeing cows that are developing mastitis, that start to look, for lack of a better word, like crap, that are infected with influenza, it's really too late. So what we really need to do is get folks like Dr. Lombard in there in those weeks leading up to that. And so I know it's in the beginning of this, it was scary. A lot of producers didn't want to report. They didn't understand the implications of it. They watched the poultry industry having to depopulate birds because of it. And so it had this scarlet letter. But I would encourage producers in California to keep an open mind and open your doors to folks like Dr. Jason Lombard. He's a cow veterinarian as well as an epidemiologist. And it's these investigations, I cannot emphasize enough, are crucial, absolutely crucial to defining this disease and how it's spreading between operations. And until we know that, it's very difficult to give targeted advice as to how to keep it out.
And you mentioned that in the poultry industry, they did have to go through and do still have to go through depopulating birds because of the H5.
Yes.
Is it the same situation in dairy?
No, it's not, fortunately. So in birds, this particular type of influenza is highly pathogenic. So that's why we call it HPAI. So the virus in cows actually acts more like a low pathogenic influenza. When it gets into commercial poultry operations, it will kill a large portion of those birds anyways. But the government defines it as a foreign animal disease on the poultry side, even though it's the same virus. And so the method by which to control that is to stamp it out, which requires depopulation. It is not considered a foreign animal disease on the dairy side. And so that is why it's managed a bit differently, even though it's the same virus. But keep in mind, a lot of these dairies have poultry producers in proximity. And so it's going to be important to bear that in mind as you move your animals around, as you manage your operations day to day, to help to safeguard some of your neighbors against this virus that have poultry.
So, like you mentioned, there's still a lot of questions out there about how this is being spread, about all of the different steps it goes. But is there a vaccine? Is there prevention that our dairy operators can be looking at? What's their best course of action to help keep this from hitting their herds?
So at this point in time, really, biosecurity is number one in preventing the introduction of this virus onto operations. If we look at the typical dairy operation, unfortunately, most of them are fairly bio insecure. We've been fortunate in our country to not have a significant disease come through on the dairy side that would require such high levels of biosecurity, such as FMD. And so we've gotten a little bit lax. So our biosecurity is fairly porous on these operations. And first and foremost, biosecurity is going to be key. Now, biosecurity is a buzzword that encompasses a myriad of different items that need to be addressed. So I'll give a few examples. So one thing would be workers, right? Some of the epidemiologic links in Michigan, for instance, looking at between dairies and from dairy to poultry operations that were getting infected, was associated with common workers. And so making certain that folks that are coming into the operation are wearing clean clothes, that they're not dragging in virus on them would be one example of biosecurity. So perhaps providing workers with farm clothes that are specific to your operation would be an example. There's tons of resources out there, and I'm happy to provide additional resources if folks were interested in reaching out to me to help bolster that biosecurity program. So that's number one. Now, you mentioned vaccines. At this point in time, there are no vaccines that are available for the use of vaccinating against influenza A in dairy cattle or poultry. And part of that is associated with trade. So on the poultry side, we do not vaccinate against highly pathogenic avian influenza because it would impact our export market. So we're seeing a lot of moving and shaking on this front across the industries because we're seeing that this threat isn't going away. And part of managing the threat is managing the susceptible population. So those are the animals like on your dairies. You replace a third of your herd every year with replacement heifers. So those heifers are likely going to serve as a naive host for this virus to continue to jump into, allowing for it to be perpetuated on your operation. So vaccination probably will make sense for those heifers that are being added into your herd, for instance. So again, I'm hoping that the U.S. opens their minds to the use of influenza A vaccines in cattle and potentially poultry, but that's yet to be determined.
Our guest this morning, Dr. Kay Russo of RSM Consulting. We are talking about highly pathogenic avian influenza, which has made its way into dairy herds across the nation. So what about looking bigger picture as far as policy goes? Is there a policy now that is helpful? And if there's not, is there a policy that could be helpful?
So at present, the policies that exist surrounding this disease are largely well defined on the poultry side. So when an operation gets infected, there's a huge book. We call it the red book, right? And it's like the playbook of what needs to happen with an operation. And then that also impacts a trait associated with, for instance, the state that they found that operation in. But at present, the policy is very poorly designed or defined, I should say, on the dairy side because this is a new threat. And so ultimately, I think it's going to be important for policymakers to consider the issue across different production animal species and provide more of a comprehensive policy that ensures that we're able to control this virus because it is an existential threat across poultry, across dairy, and potentially even swine. It's not yet been identified in commercial swine, but there is the possibility that it will be. And certainly we're calling upon policymakers to get serious about this and really start to draft out essentially a path forward.
So I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. How devastating could this be if we don't actually take good, strong action now?
You mentioned H5NX, it's always changing the name. The thing about the virus is it's constantly changing too. It's what we call an RNA virus, and so it mutates a lot. And it has the ability, its genetic information is like a card deck. So if an animal gets infected with the dairy variant of the virus and perhaps gets infected with a human variant of the virus, say like a pig, for instance, then the card decks can be reassorted. So this virus is remarkable with respect to its ability to change. And if we are unable to get ahead of it, or at least keep pace with it, there is a chance that it will continue to mutate. There's a chance that it may mutate to become essentially more capable of spreading human to human. We've seen some cases in humans working on the dairies, for instance. Now, the concern is that it will essentially mutate and become human adapted. And that could trip, and I don't want to scare people, but it could potentially trip another pandemic. And so you're looking at this virus that has implications on the health of our production species, but also could have huge implications on public health. And so we need to keep pace with it. We need to figure out how it's moving between operations. We need to put together a more cohesive strategy to control it. And the first step of that is really getting that information regarding how it's moving.
We have to take a quick break, but we will have more with Dr. Russo coming up right after this.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
We continue now our discussion on H5N1, the avian influenza, with Dr. K. Russo. All right, and so bottom line, what would you want our listeners to know, especially our listeners in the dairy area around California? What do you think that they need to know about this?
So I think you have to ultimately prepare. In most of the states that have been affected, we've seen a large portion of the dairies that get infected. So be prepared. Make certain that you work with your veterinarian to develop protocols in order to treat those animals with supportive care that's appropriate in order to get them through the event. And make certain that your workers have access to personal protective equipment. So ultimately, this virus likes the eyes. Make certain at the very least these folks have eyewear to cover their eyes, and it would be nice for them to have a mask. I realize, being an old dairy veterinarian myself, that this isn't always ideal to wear all day working on a dairy, but in the heat of the outbreak, when that viral load is high, make certain those folks have access to it. If your employees are expressing that they're not feeling well, please encourage that they go and see a physician and that they receive adequate treatment. Because again, this has the capacity to end up being a major public health issue. Now, from the stance of testing, don't look at this like the scarlet letter. It's likely that you and your neighbors and the number of folks that you know are going to get infected with this. What really would help is if you open up your doors, allow for early testing, and find this virus quickly before your cows get sick. That will allow you to be prepared for when they become clinical, and it will allow for folks like Dr. Jason Lombard's team to come in and define this virus, because we do not know what we do not measure, and we cannot provide guidelines around what we do not know. And so please let folks come in and help to characterize this virus so that we can get ahead of this beast.
Extremely important conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Russo, for joining us this morning. Switching gears now, I'm handing the mic over to farm broadcaster Brian Winnikins, who's talking with the head of USDA Rural Utility Service, Andy Burke. And they chat about things like better broadband around the nation's rural areas and an announcement about a nuclear plant. Here's Brian Winnikins.
I'm Brian Winnikins. Joining us this morning, Andy Burke. He's administrator with USDA's Rural Utility Service. And so these, I know that with these renewable projects, specifically the solar and wind, there's also, though, a lot of concern that some really good farmland, which grows food, is being taken out of production for this. How does USDA balance this?
Well, I am part of the Department of Agriculture. We care a lot about farms, and Secretary Vilsack is always concerned about making sure that we have food security in our country and that small and independent farmers are able to continue. So there's a couple of things. Number one is we encourage there to be community benefits and to make sure that we are, whenever possible, not building on prime agricultural farmland. And one of the things that we think is that some of the farmers will be able to use some money that they get from renting a portion of their non-productive farmland to solar arrays so that they can then put that money into tractors or whatever they need to farm more productively and keep their farm in their family.
Also, Andy, I know that another big concern, I guess I'll speak for the fire department, this battery project. Do rural fire departments have to be trained here? Because when these batteries start on fire, especially with cars, I mean, even in Wisconsin now, the license plate has an EV sticker to alert the fire department. What about that? The safety and even the recycling of these batteries. I mean, doesn't that have to play a part in all of this?
We look at all those different pieces. So we have an entire engineering teams, and these are complex batteries that have been around for a long time. And so we have the experience to kind of know and have seen these deployed over time. That does a couple of things. Number one is we want to check and make sure that they're safe before they're ever put in there. The second thing is, because they've been around for a while, what is happening is that prices are going down and the quality is going up. It's just like your home computer where today it can do things it didn't do 5 years ago, that couldn't do things that it did 10 years before that. So that's what's happening now in the battery world, is tremendous advances while the price is coming down, and then you add on top of that our grants. It just is fundamentally changing the equation so that clean energy is now more affordable than just about anything else you can find.
What about the recycling part of it? Even in Minnesota right now, they had to go after a group of the utilities because there's stacks and stacks of old wind turbine blades that they can't recycle. The batteries, if they can't be recyclable, doesn't it counter the clean energy part of this whole equation if it's not recyclable?
Yeah, so each of these projects goes through an environmental review to make sure that we know what's happening there and that there's a plan. And I'll give you one example. So one of the projects, or several of the projects today have this, but one of the projects is in Iowa that we announced today. They're doing a bunch of plantings, and we've done the environmental review to make sure that at the end of that, the ground will actually be more productive and fertile than it is today before they put the solar panels on top. So each of these projects, that's the reason that we do these kind of reviews.
Talking with Andy Burke, rather. He's Administrator, USDA Rural Utility Service. Okay, I'm going to switch gears from electricity to broadband. Now, rural utilities, we're trying to get broadband into rural America. And we talk about the old REA and how long of a rollout for rural electrification. People are going to have to be patient with getting rural broadband. But there's also probably, isn't there an opportunity to say, let's duplicate what we did with REA, and I'll use an example in western Wisconsin. Pierce Pepin Cooperative Services, a rural electric co-op, got tired of waiting for the national ISP provider to provide rural broadband. They said, we're doing this ourselves. Kind of makes sense. They already have the right of way. They already have a lot of the infrastructure. why isn't USDA saying, hey, let's talk to all the rural electric co-ops and let's get with them and get this moving?
Well, you're exactly right, and that is what we're doing. So over the course of the last few years, we put a little bit under $4 billion into new high-speed internet projects. Most of that has gone to either rural electric cooperatives or to telephone cooperatives. That's mainly who comes to us for funding. And the Biden administration has made its goal to get to every single American. And that sounds ambitious, and having traveled around our country over the course of the last couple of years, it is incredibly difficult to do. But we are doing that in large part through entities like cooperatives, just as you are saying. And that's been our history at the Rural Utility Service, starting as the REA. Before I did this job, I was the mayor of Chattanooga, Tennessee. We were the first city to do universal fiber to every single home and business, and it's exactly what you said. We knew that nobody else was coming, so we did it ourselves. And it's that kind of spirit in rural America that both gets you the service that you need, and also that makes sure that the jobs that you're talking about end up in rural Wisconsin.
As we move forward with this, I know that there's, is it hard though to be able to make this work? Because USDA has a program, FCC has a program. I'm betting the FTC has a program. Every department has a program for this. Would it make more sense to say, let's just have one group do this, or is it better to have it divided up?
Well, the Biden-Harris administration has made this goal that every American will do this, and so $65 billion went into the bipartisan infrastructure law for high-speed internet to go everywhere. And it did go to several places, including to Rural Utility Service at the USDA. And what I would say is, this is what Congress wants, and so this is the way we're going to do it. The good thing about splitting it up is that we have relationships in rural America. That's our specialty. And so by giving us that funding, then we're able to make sure that it's deployed in the best possible way in rural America. Now, there are other entities, in the federal government, they have different kinds of traditions and relationships. And so maybe there are portions of cities that need this funding. We don't have the relationships there, and that's why it makes sense. In the long run, it's really important for us to make sure that we're not duplicating the funding. So that's the big piece, and we've spent a lot of time. It's been a huge piece of the Biden-Harris administration's goal is we meet regularly, and now before anybody gives out a grant, we circulate everything to any other agency that is working in this area to make sure we're not supplying money to the same place twice. And as long as we're being efficient with taxpayer dollars, it'll work out.
Finally, Andy, and again, I'll go back to the electric side here because this is something that just kind of popped into my head. Recently, there was a big announcement that 3 Mile Island's coming back online, and it's going to help Microsoft. So that company is making 3 Mile Island operational again to provide power for Microsoft's data center. And nuclear power has zero emissions. Well, here in western Wisconsin, Dairyland Power has the old Genoa nuclear power plant right along the Mississippi River. So is that potentially something that has to also be looked at where, as rural utility service, okay, if there's, again, like the batteries, there's new technology, it could be safer, those sort of things that we have to look at that?
Well, I'm not going to talk about the Dairyland part. What I will say is there's already been a lot of press around the fact that there's another nuclear plant that is likely to get repowered. That's in Michigan. And the same co-ops that we're dealing with are involved in that process, and there will be an announcement about that very, very soon, very, very soon. But I think what you'll see is that this is transforming the energy industry, and that is the first nuclear plant that has ever been repowered in our country. And so when we're trying to make this transition to clean energy, we got to look at all the opportunities. Certainly, nuclear is a focus of ours.
That is, wow, we found out something coming down the line. I like it. And Sandy Burke, he's administrator with USDA Rural Utilities Service.
And that was Brian Winnikins reporting. Some quick headline news for you. Legislation introduced in the House and Senate would extend a new sustainable aviation fuel tax credit for biofuels for 10 years and prevent foreign producers from accessing the credits. Groups like National Corn Growers Association applauded the legislation that supports domestic producers. NCGA President Harold Woolley says corn growers are making every effort to help the airline industry lower its greenhouse gas emissions through the use of corn ethanol. The 45Z tax credit provides incentives to refineries that produce biofuels that can be used in commercial aircraft. The National Oilseed Processors Association and the American Soybean Association also hailed the legislation. Oilseed Processor Association President Kaylee Buller says they commend the bipartisan, bicameral legislative effort that puts U.S. fuel producers, crushers, and farmers first. This is the AgNet News Hour. When we come back, we're talking with a hog farmer from Iowa about California's Prop 12. And don't forget, if you've missed any of our shows or if you just want to catch it at a different time, you can always subscribe to our podcast by searching for the AgNet News Hour on your favorite podcast downloading app. This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. What about humates in animal feed? When can you add humates to the animal feed, and what is the benefit of that?
So the interesting thing about animal feeds is just like the fertilizer side, there's actually a lot going on in legislative processes. So there's an act out called the Innovative Feed Act. And currently, you can't include things in animal feed that are giving you other benefits besides nutritive benefits. Let's say, for example, you had a cow that was eating a product that reduced its methane emissions, those enteric gases that are caused just in the natural digestion of a ruminating cow. You can't claim that those products do that benefit. So hopefully people will get involved and say, look, the Innovative Feed Act is necessary and should help farmers. Other benefits of feeding humate is obviously first to reduce enteric gases. But the second one, these are old plant materials. So those plant materials are rich in trace minerals. So not only are you getting something that's going to help the digestion of the animal, you're also getting an abundant supply of minerals. So that is the main reason farmers are currently including in their animal feeds.
This is all fascinating, but it can be hard to retain some of this information when you're hearing this on the radio or through the podcast. So is there someplace online, or where can our listeners go and get more information?
Well, the good news is the acts I mentioned, like the Innovative Feed Act and the Plant Biostimulant Act, are publicly available through Congress. You can actually go look at those acts. They're on the website there. The other information you can get is directly through Live Earth Products. So if you go to liveearth.com, contact us. You can contact us and our agronomy team. And we're happy to go over any details, questions about how to use these products, how they fit your farm program, how to use them as a tool to implement conservation practices such as nutrient retention, water conservation, and improving soil health.
To get to know more about Live Earth Products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com.
Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Sabrina Halverson.
California's Prop 12, passed in 2018, set new standards for animal welfare by requiring more spacious confinement for farm animals, including pigs, hens, and veal calves. The law mandates that products sold in California, even if they are produced elsewhere, must meet these requirements. Now, while it aims to improve animal treatment, it has sparked many debates over increased costs and challenges for farmers nationwide. Normally, when I talk with hog farmers, they're against it. But last week, I heard farmer Ron Mardesen speak on a panel during New York Climate Week, and I wanted to get his thoughts. I'll let him start off by introducing himself. Ron?
My name is Ron Mardesen, and I'm a Nyman Ranch hog farmer. I am the fifth generation to farm the farm that I'm on, and my farm is located in rural Elliott, Iowa, which is in the southwest corner of the state.
All right. I wanted to talk a bit with you today. First off, I watched one of the panels that you were on this week, and I really enjoyed listening to your story, and I thought that you just had a lot of insight that I wanted you to share with my listeners. And if we could talk for a little bit about your farming philosophies. And that was one of the things that I heard you talking about was how you care for your animals. And it goes against a little bit about what we're hearing about hog farmers these days. But tell me about your ranch and what you do specifically.
The best way to describe the farm is to say that we let a pig be a pig. We let the cattle be cattle. We let the chickens be chickens, etc. In the 70s and 80s, as everybody gravitated more and more towards what we would consider modern factory farming, Dad and I drew a line in the sand. We decided we were not going to do that. We didn't think it was right to cram intelligent animals like pigs into concrete boxes. And we didn't think it was right to put chickens into wire cages. We adopted a philosophy that we would do anything and everything in our power to make sure that they could exhibit as many of their natural behaviors as they had. And we've continued with that philosophy up to this day. That flies contrary to the modern concepts in agriculture, but ultimately our choices has been what I feel is the right one because I can sleep better at night. And I'm lucky enough to be able to have raised my family under this mantra and under this philosophy. And I think they're better individuals. And I know the livestock that we've produced has been better and had a higher quality of life than they would have otherwise.
So what really caught my attention when I heard you discussing this on that panel, of course, I report in California primarily, and the show that we're recording this for airs in California, and California
Right.
voters voted in Proposition 12, which deals with animal housing and provides regulations on how hogs have to be housed or not housed. So you are already in compliance with that
Correct.
just naturally through the way
Correct.
that you farm. And I wanted to get your opinions because normally I will tell you when I'm interviewing people about Prop 12, they are normally very much anti Prop 12 and don't want to be told anything about how to raise their animals, which I understand. We don't really want voters in other states dictating how farming is done in another state. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on Prop 12 and if it does apply to your business at all.
Proposition 12 is huge as far as my business is concerned. I sell into a niche market. I sell into Nyman Ranch, and that's a network of 500 independent family farmers like myself. And one of the requirements to sell into the Nyman Ranch system is that your livestock, your pigs in particular, can never be in gestation crates or any farrowing crate of any type. We feel that they're not necessary. And this falls in perfectly with my philosophy too. If you are careful in the selection of the females that you use for the mamas, and if you're careful in the selection of the temperament, if you give them plenty of room, if you get them plenty of good, clean feed and water and adequate space, you do not need the gestation crate or the farrowing crate. Proposition 12, in my opinion, was a watershed moment in terms of California voters saying, you know what, we don't think it's right to put something that is as intelligent as a pig into a box that's 2 foot wide, 7 foot long, for 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. She deserves a better life than that, and I am grateful for that. The myths, and I call them myths, and maybe that's too hard a description, but the misconceptions that you have to do this, or the sow, which is a female mama pig, will be in trouble. There'll be aggression from other sows, or they'll be picked on, or this and that, is a misconception. It doesn't happen. If, like I said earlier, that I have raised pigs this way for 40 years, and I have not seen that aggression. I have not seen those issues. There are moments, there are hiccups like in every situation, but through careful genetic selection, through careful management on my part, I have survived, and I would add I've thrived raising livestock without the use of either gestation crates or farrowing crates. And I commend California voters for saying that they think this is the way that it should be done.
I hear from other farmers that I speak to, one of their concerns is that they've been raising their hogs, they've been raising their pigs in the way using the gestation crates and other housing, and now they're going to have to change everything. It's going to be extremely costly. Do you think that Prop 12 is going to have the big impact on the pork industry that many in the pork industry seem to be bracing for?
The thing that I find most interesting about this, Prop 12 was passed, in 1819? So we're going on 5-6 years since it was passed, and it actually went into law in January. And the thing that I find is we have seen no great, huge shortages of pork. We have somehow, the industry has adjusted, it's shifted, it's morphed a little bit. But everybody's apprehension about, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go to gestation crate-free type housing for my sows is a little misleading. First off, California represents what, 13, 14, 15% of the pork market that this country has. So there's another 85 to 86% of the market that is totally free and independent of that. Second off, there was already a significant number of the pigs that were being produced in the country that came from sows that were not housed. in these gestation created systems anyway. So I think a lot of it is fear mongering, and I think a lot of it is unjustified. I don't really see it's going to be much of any or have any type of impact in a negative way on the folks that choose to continue to raise pigs the way they are.
If you were able to speak with other farmers, which I mean, you like you said, you've been on so many panels recently, you've practically have been talking to all the other farmers. How would you explain your experience to them if they're concerned about changing how they're farming and what the future looks like? How would you explain to them the experience that you've had your entire farming career with raising animals like this?
I get it. I understand until you try something different, you're apprehensive. I understand this, but I think what I do is I explain that genetic selection is key, management is key, and these are things that have to be tweaked. If you want to continue to use the gestation crates the way you are, continue with what you're doing. But if nothing else, the pork industry has taught us that it's very adaptable and it's very changeable. And there seems to be no situation that we've come up against that we can't overcome. I can appreciate the apprehension. I can appreciate the confusion, but sit back and take a calm look at it and evaluate what the consumer wants, evaluate what is good for the animal, and ultimately evaluate what's good for your operation.
And can we talk about you as a farmer just a little bit more? I was reading some stories that have been written about you, and I just think you have a very interesting story. Can you tell my listeners just a little bit about how you started farming and some of the changes that you have seen from when you started farming through now?
Sure, you bet. I tell people I've lived a very boring life. I live 1 mile away from where I grew up. When I was 16 years old, I fell head over and heels in love with a gal, and I'm still married to her. And here we are almost 50 years later. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my great-grandparents farmed this ground, and it was and still is what I would call a traditional farm, and the grain walked off the farm. In other words, we grew corn, we grew oats, grew wheat, and eventually soybeans, but we fed all of that to the livestock, and then it was the livestock that walked off the farm. That's why we said that we walked the grain off the farm. But we would use our own natural fertilizers. In other words, the manure from the animals was what we turned around and spread back out onto the fields, and that's where the fertilizer came from. We made the decision in the late 70s and early 80s not to go the way of the confinements or the way of what is now considered conventional agriculture. We continued to rotate our crops. We continued to use natural fertilizers in the term of the manure and stuff back on the ground. We wanted the animals to be raised in pastures or in deeply bedded pens. And in 1998, the commodity market had taken a pretty significant grip on livestock production, particularly pork production, and just about squeezed the last of the independent hog farmers out. And at that time, we began to look for a different way to market our pigs. And I found Nyman Ranch, which I said is a network of independent family farmers that raise pigs outside. We are a niche market that is an animal welfare friendly market. We're certified by 2 or 3 different animal welfare groups. We sell to a lot of restaurant chains, both on the East and the West Coast. I found Nyman Ranch and ultimately decided to join them in 2002. And I did that and never looked back. But I tell people that I don't farm 5,000 acres. I don't want to farm 5,000 acres. I am farming 131 acres, and I've been able to raise my 3 children on this, and I've been able to spend my life on this farm. I am pleased to say that I've watched my parents grow old on this farm, and I've watched my children grow up on this farm, and I consider myself a blessed individual.
And that sounds like just a wonderful endorsement for farming in general. And if you were to talk with young farmers who are looking at this life in front of them and getting into this industry, what would you tell them?
I don't want this to be a sale for Nyman Ranch, an advertisement for them, but quite honestly, I don't think I can remember a time in the near history that I've been as optimistic about the future of agriculture as I am right now. People would look at me and say, gosh, Mardesen, you're going off the deep end. But the consumers are beginning to see and they're beginning to appreciate where their food comes from. And they're beginning to ask questions like, what is the cost? What is the true cost of this cheap feed or this cheap food that we've been having? What is being sacrificed? When we look at water quality and the deterioration, when we look at air quality, Iowa has the second highest cancer rate in the nation. And that's appalling. And part of that is because of all the stuff we're dumping on the ground. But the consumers are beginning to notice this, and the consumers are beginning to say, no, that's not right. If I were a young person today, and what I would tell young people today is don't be afraid to think outside the box. Don't be afraid to step back and say the modern and the current systems in agriculture, I'm talking both mega production, the monocultures, if you will, aren't necessarily right. There are other avenues out there. There are other opportunities out there. Go for it. Don't be afraid to try something different because they are on the horizon. They're on the crest, and they're what's going to come.
All right. Do you have any other comments for our listeners? Anything else that you want to say to our listeners out in California?
Yes, I do. I want to applaud them for what they did with Proposition 12. I don't want them to sit back and assume that what they did was wrong. I want to say what they did was right. I want them to be proud of that fact. I want them also, don't give up yet, because the EATS Act is still looming, in D.C. We need to continue to push. We need to continue to see this thing through, because what they've done is a tremendous beginning to what I hope is going to become a tremendous movement.
All right. Thank you, Ron. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Also look for Sabrina Halverson on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast by searching for AgNet West on your podcast app. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.